Hello, my name is Paula Guthett, and I'm the co-founder and programmer at Cinema Detroit, an independent community movie theater, which is also the only 7-day-a-week movie theater in greater downtown Detroit. Welcome to our discussion of I'm Not Your Negro, which screened online yesterday free of charge, thanks to the Knight Foundation, Magnolia Pictures, and O Cinema in Miami. The film is also available via Virtual Cinema Detroit, which is online at cinemadetroit.org/virtual-cinema. Part of our mission at Cinema Detroit is to provide a community gathering place for watching films and for the dialogue that they spark. So thanks are also due to the Free Film Festival for their help with setting up this discussion for us, particularly the tech side. Yesterday, as I rewatched I'm Not Your Negro, it struck me again that the clothing, the hairstyles, the cars have changed since the 50s and 60s, and the police wear more gear now. But what's happening in the archival footage and on the news today hasn't changed. The violence is the same. The United States is still, as James Baldwin says in the film, we're trapped between what we would like to be and what we actually are. So I Am Not Your Negro is as relevant as it ever was. So let's welcome our panelists. Harrison Shelby is a community organizer, mentor, and servant leader. He is the Community and Engagement Manager Youth at Detroit Phoenix Center, a nonprofit organization that provides critical support and resources to at-risk youth. He brings positive energy, a deep passion for community revitalization, a wealth of social change, nonprofit, and youth leadership expertise, and a strong desire to serve youth, families, and community. Harrison has also engaged his community as an elected precinct delegate, and some of his leadership experience includes AmeriCorps Public Ally, served 2 terms, Young Elected Officials Frontline Leaders Academy Fellow, Young People for Fellow, and Regional Youth Intern with Michigan Roundtable for Diversity and Inclusion. Dez Squire, known as Dez, is a suburban organizer who works with communities and organizations interested in engaging their members for a deeper understanding of structural racism as they work toward racial justice. She believes that understanding history and the social dynamics for racism and oppression will lead to a better understanding for the experiences of today and create more effective change. Dez has training in crisis response, domestic violence crisis response, mediation, and evaluation. She holds a master's in social work, macro concentration from Wayne State University, and a Juris Doctor from Western Michigan University Thomas M. Cooley Law School. Adriel Thornton is a Detroit-based creative contributor and culture creator who has earned global recognition as a leading authority in the creative arts and events production field. Thornton was born and raised in Northwest Detroit and earned a bachelor's degree in public relations from Wayne State University. He was introduced to the techno and house music sound by his older cousins who frequented the seminal nightclub, the Music Institute. In the early 90s, he began helping other venues distribute flyers for parties and club nights, kickstarting his career as a promoter. Since then, Thornton has produced hundreds of events, including major global festivals, award-winning nightclubs, screenings, and more. As a leader in creative culture, he has spoken on panels at South by Southwest, Cinetopia, Model D, and was recently selected to be the representative of Detroit's entrepreneurial and creative class for Virgin Airlines, with co-hosts Brigitte Russell of Shinola, Dan Gilbert from Quicken Loans, and Richard Branson of Virgin. As an event producer, Adriel has achieved international acclaim. His club event, Family, now in its 23rd year, was voted Best Club Night in America, and has hosted talent from around the world. In 2000, Thornton was instrumental in launching the DEMF and helped produce it through 2002. Additional signature productions include Dally in the Alley, Eastern Market After Dark, Dine Drink Detroit, and the Night Arts Challenge Award Ceremony, which some of us were definitely there. Thornton also serves as an experience host for Airbnb, with visitors around the world partaking in his techno tour and experience. Thornton also currently serves as Director of Marketing and Community Outreach for MoGo, Detroit's nonprofit bike share system. And finally, let's bring in our moderator, Juanita Anderson. She is a filmmaker, media educator, and still photographer who was born and raised in Detroit. She is the 2019 to 2020 Murray E. Jackson Creative Scholar in the Arts at Wayne State University, where she heads the Media Arts and Studies program in the Department of Communication. As a producer, director, and executive producer, Juanita's work in public media and independent film spans more than 4 decades and includes the groundbreaking African-American community-based television series Detroit Black Journal and Say Brother. Her executive producer credits include the 1988 Academy Award-nominated documentary feature film Who Killed Vincent Chin, the 4-hour ITVS commissioned series Positive Life with HIV, and the Favorite Poem Project video anthology originally created for the bicentennial of the Library of Congress. A longstanding advocate for diversity in media, Juanita co-founded the National Black Programming Consortium, now known as Black Public Media, in 1978, and has served on the board of directors of the Independent Television Service. She is a past president of the National Conference of Artists and which is the nation's oldest African-American arts organization. She is a board member of the Michigan chapter of the National Conference of Artists, an advisor to the Detroit Narrative Agency, and an active member of Final Girls, a Detroit-based organization committed to uplifting the work of women media makers. So welcome, everyone, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion. Thank you all for coming, and let's go.
Thank you, Paula, and thank you to all of the organizations that have helped to sponsor this discussion and screening of I Am Not Your Negro. I want to start with just my reflections over the weekend, if I might, because I've spent a lot of time, because the media has not really been that great at covering what's happening around the globe. With respect to what I see as a global uprising that has occurred in the midst of this pandemic. So I've been trying to sort of track what international news outlets have been saying about what is happening. And I ran across the Economist article that was published last Thursday, which is called The Fire This Time. The Economist, for those of you who don't know, is published in England. But I thought it was quite pertinent to our discussion tonight because they take the title The Fire This Time after James Baldwin's 1963 work, The Fire Next Time. But they talk about Baldwin, and let me see if I can pull it up and quote him as saying that racism compromises where it does not corrupt. All the American efforts to build a better world here, there, or anywhere. And I'm struck in this film that Baldwin is less concerned about himself as a Black man in America, and I should say a Black gay man in America, but more concerned about the future of America as a whole and the future of the Western world. I want to know from each of you what resonates with you the most in this film. And Adriel, why don't you start?
Thank you, Anita. Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, what a powerful film this is, and it's so relevant to today. But definitely serves as a reminder or shows how long this struggle has been going on. So there were a couple of things that really sort of struck me about this, and it's number one that the story of the Negro in America is the story of America. And that you cannot separate the two and act like they are two different things. One is the same as the other. And then that the sort of the white guilt, or the white imagination, in a sense, whatever is sort of the root of this, and that this is very squarely an issue that they created. They created the Negro, the nigger, the this, the that, and that it's really sort of deeply in their hands to come up with the solutions for this, right? They have to fix the problem that they created. And another thing that was super powerful to me that Baldwin said was that he is not a ward of this country, i.e. the country doesn't have to take care of him. He's not here to be their child or whatever. And it's because that he is one of the people that built this country, just like our ancestors did. They built this country. So those were some very
Yes.
powerful things.
What resonated for you in this film?
I think I could definitely echo Adriel in regards to just seeing how consistent the narrative and the story was in that, and how you can just transpose it with the imagery and the stories and the experiences that we are continuing to see today, and even within the last few weeks and the last couple months. And that I think a couple of the things that like really stand out to me is in regards to needing to learn that history and unlearn the narratives that the white community has told in order to provide comfort for themselves, and this idea of that we are in this country fair and square, that we are all in our homes or in these communities through great achievement, and that not recognizing the bodies and the deaths that have been built up around that to lay the legacy that is America. And so for me, it's like seeing that, his touching on history and that, and then the other part about fear and that, and when he talks about that like in particular for like white people, and that like that there's this rage and there's this hatred, and it's because underneath that surface we don't want to touch that fear. And some of the things that I see like pop up in the protest, or some of the language that when we think about like realtor steering, and the messaging that has been created to build stereotypes about the Black community and about like Black men in particular, and that like if we think about white women and Black men, you know, we see these stereotypes built around safety and that. And so to be able to delve deeper into understanding our stories, our history, and being able to get into what's really beneath that surface, I think is really poignant. And I think those are the things that are really setting with me right now with James Baldwin's pieces.
I want to come back to that in a little bit, but I want to bring in Harrison if I can. And Harrison, as you're thinking about your screening of the film, what stands out to you?
What stand out to me was really James Baldwin really telling the stories of Dr. King, Malcolm X, and Medgar, and even looking closely at how young people were organizing in the civil rights movement. And for myself, that's really relevant. I'm only 24 years of age, and I've been doing this work for some time. And what I'm seeing now during this time is there are a lot of people, there's a renewed sense of wanting to do something and activism, and people having different ideologies and methods to progress. And I'm seeing that a lot in younger activists, especially with everything that's going on around police brutality. And I've even had experiences this past week where there's been a difference in ideologies as far as how to organize a particular protest or march, whether that was to include the police or not, and just seeing different methods, but understanding that we're fighting for the same causes and things like that. So that stood out to me, and also just him talking about, well, really just talking about the narrative that white America has uplifted and perpetuated through mainstream media, through certain imagery and roles, especially in Hollywood.
Before we go on, and I want to pick up right back up on that point, I just want to make sure that the people who are watching us either on Facebook or on YouTube know that we're going to be taking questions. So think about them. And for those of you who have not seen the film or haven't seen it in a while, the period that James Baldwin is addressing within the film runs from basically 1955 through 1968, from his first encounter with Medgar Evers through the assassination of Martin Luther King, and along the way, Medgar Evers is assassinated, Malcolm X is assassinated, Martin Luther King is assassinated, and we witness through the amazing skills of filmmaker Raoul Peck connections between the violence against Black people of that era juxtaposed with the killings of Black men and women in that period up through to in the 21st century up through 2016 when the film was completed. So the filmmaker is actually making connections between our past and present state, and I think that we can go further. But I really wanted to touch on what you said about James Baldwin's concern with what we're seeing on screen, both how Black people are represented as well as what we learn of America in this time. And towards the end of the film, he says, to watch the TV screen for any length of time is to learn something really frightening, some really frightening things about the American sense of reality. And his references to reality shows in that particular moment, but I can't help but thinking what we have witnessed since the pandemic on screen, when many of us were home watching our screens. The releasing of footage shot by neighbors of the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. In our own state, the mobs with militia mobs with guns storming the Capitol. Amy Cooper, her great performance before the camera where she attempts to use her cell phone as a weapon. And then, of course, and I have to call it a lynching of George Floyd right before our very eyes. And I can't help but think that in these acts of racism, that there's a new audacity that we've witnessed over the last few months, and that as much as we as Black people have learned to record these incidents of violence, that racist white America has learned to use the media to perpetuate its own goals. And as I looked at this, and I'm sure everybody has seen that still frame of the cop with his neck on George Floyd's knee, looking at the camera as if to say, okay, I see you're there, but I'm going to keep on doing my thing, and let me show you. Talk to me about this and what's happening as the world is watching what's happening in America through the screen.
Right. I think it's really interesting that you said that. I mean, that was that moment that she talked about with George Floyd was actually the piece that stuck the most with me. Was the look on this cop's face, this officer's face, looking at the camera and almost, understanding that there was going to be no consequence for him. Because that is literally what's happened in almost every single case in the past. And with what's happening with that guy in the White House, I feel like there's a lot of folks in this country who have become emboldened because of that lack of leadership, or their, maybe to them, leadership that in a way sort of gives them the power, or the illusion of power, to be able to continue to do these things, because they really do feel like they are in the right and that they have zero consequences to be paid.
Harrison, any thoughts? Harrison.
Yes. So I remember seeing in the film a similar position of the police putting his knee into, I think it was a young lady's neck, if I'm not mistaken. And that's many years ago. And fast forward to now, to seeing that in a similar thing. It just, I guess it creates this, that they can use these particular practices and it's within their sanction. And even if it's recorded, they're still going to be, there's no justice. And so it's creating this, this sense of like terror or fear in people, and it's intergenerational trauma that's being, like, when I'm seeing these images, like I can barely stomach to watch this, just knowing the history, and it's just and how it's still relevant to this day. It almost gets it brings up, evokes this anger, and James Baldwin talked about the rage that is inside of black men, and also and how white men approach their relationships with black men, and its sense of terror. So like those relationships are still fractured to this day. But Saturday, I participated in a march at the Charles H. Wright Museum, and it was led by a group of black men, and our focus was to rewrite the narrative. And there was a lot of our white allies and brothers there, and it was one pivotal moment where one of the organizers, Dave Woods from Enjoy Detroit, he called all of them up and to stand in front of them. And he made them say, "I love you, black men." And to repeat that over and over again. And it was one moment where one of our white brothers broke down and really embraced them. And and I think we really need to have these tough interactions and dialogue, really just humanity. So yeah.
Dez, what are you thinking?
So a couple of things that to me that stood out in that was in regards to like the language and that. So not just the imagery, but the language that gets paired with some of the pictures and that. So if we kind of jump into some hurricane disasters and that, the use of language as looters versus survivors, like looking for, foraging for supplies. That popped up in Hurricane Katrina, I believe. And then seeing similar language in the 1967 rebellion, that the language of looter was used to justify deaths, and was to make it okay that individuals were being shot and murdered. That we saw 43 deaths come out of that, and so many of them are community members, and that with no outcome, like there was no justice held. We had a people's tribunal as a result of that because the judicial system wasn't going to do anything. There's families that are still grieving and holding on to that pain because they've lost somebody and they haven't had that form of justice yet, to be able to help with closure and to be able to move forward, and so to think about what justice is, we have to look beyond and look at the systems that we have, and we see that corruption and the brokenness of it. I know I hear activists and organizers talk about how our criminal justice system is working perfectly because it's being used to oppress the Black community, the Brown community, It's being used as a way to force a new form of slavery. And that once we got rid of slavery, technically in the United States, but for everybody else, for every like non-white individual, that system is being used to just continue to harm. And what should be a sense of safety isn't there. And I look at that language that's being used to help justify deaths, and it being justified lynchings, and that the faces on those police officers, those are similar imagery that we see. We see perfect excuses as to why we can have racial profiling. And yet, what we know is that racial profiling is really an officer's way of being able to help protect communities and saying, you're not welcome, you don't belong, you look like you stand out. And that comes from that legacy of segregation. That comes from that legacy of slave catching. And that is the legacy of law enforcement. And that's the legacy of policing. And we see those ties, and the language changes, and some of the tactics change, not all of them, but we continue to see like an increased militarization of our police. Who are they fighting against? The people that they don't want in white communities or in the suburban spaces, or in more affluent areas than that. It's being used to contain people and to attack people.
Can I add to that? I think that one of the points, directly speaking to sort of what Dez had talked about, that the film made, was that these acts, a lot of these acts, these motivations, again, go back to sort of that guilty white motivation, and that really it's a reflection of them. It is fear. It is not even so much we don't want you in our community or whatever. They're protecting. It's not even so much that they're protecting anything. There is this inherent fear, and who knows the reason why it exists, but that it's a hatred that they have within themselves, and then it's projected onto the other, right? And in America, there's always the other, whether that be Native folks, whether that be the Chinese who were coming over here, and to a large extent, within the own sort of white culture, right? When the Italians came over, they were the other. When the Irish came over, they were the other. There's always some other, and it's really this idea of people needing to do that in order to make themselves seem valuable because of some inherent hole that they have inside of themselves that they just can't fill.
Why this moment? Why now? Why this uprising at this time as opposed to earlier in this century?
I think there's a lot of factors, right? So one of the things that definitely, even though the film does a really good job of showing the horrors of the past juxtaposed with the horrors of today, but I do think that one thing that's different, or maybe something that's contributed to this moment, is the fact that everyone has a camera, and that we are documenting these things, and people are actually able to see them. In the African American community, we've long known that these things happened, right? We've long known that there has been police injustice. We've long known that unarmed, innocent people were being killed, but it was always our word against theirs. Today, we've actually got the evidence, right? So there's, I think America's actually at a point where it's finally said, okay, we can only watch so much, right? And see this happen so much. This isn't a fluke. This isn't an anomaly. This thing is really happening. But I think that in this particular moment, for these actions that are happening here, that we have a few things happen, right? America took a lot of steps forward, and then someone was elected, and then all of a sudden that forward momentum was being destroyed, right? That the gains made were being erased. And so there's this pressure cooker effect that's happening with that. But then underneath that, you have to understand that we're still in, dealing with a global pandemic that in America has disproportionately affected Black and brown people. So this pressure cooker of politics Then we've got a global pandemic that's wiping folks out, and that we're having to deal with that. And that itself, illustrates unjust healthcare and things like that. So then you have this rapid succession of Black folks getting murdered, Breonna into Ahmaud into George, and I think that it really, I think that all of those things combined sort of created this perfect storm of people who were, activated in some way. To white America, I would say that the lockdowns forced people they had nothing else to do but sit at home and watch TV. So they really were able to see this, and it was like kind of impossible to sort of tune out, So I think that all those things combined have created this sort of explosion of activism, and where America as a whole, the protesters are every color you could think of, and who are coming together, and across the world, who are coming together and saying, America, enough is enough.
Just to add to that, James Baldwin, he talked about his responsibility as a witness, and I think now we all have that collective responsibility because we have everything's being captured, and so to see these images and to see these videos and it not compel you to move or to do something. I just think that's an injustice in itself. And so it causes us to examine what can we do as individuals and collectively to get involved in this work and to educate ourselves about the things that have been happening and what can we do to move forward collectively. And I also think this is an opportune time. Like I've seen people being activated in the activism space that haven't been involved, and it's interesting that we're in the middle of this like crazy year with the pandemic, this an election year, the census, and just everything that's going on. It's people are seeing like they can't just sit back and not do anything, and they need to get involved. So, in the midst of our story is both painful and triumph at the same time. So even in the midst of Black people dying, there's some great opportunity for a lot of people to move forward and try to do something that's good. So,
is there a special role, Harrison, do you feel, for the artists to play at this time?
Yes, I think they have to be able to have that kind of influence. You should feel some kind of responsibility to be able to shift the narrative, because and create new forms of media and ways to also distribute it. I think that's one way that we can take ourselves away from this capitalistic system that's perpetuating this narrative that's not true. And I think this is a great time to really own the hashtags. If Black lives truly do matter, it starts with us and us taking control and fighting, and Dr. King talking about having a duty to fight for freedom. And so everybody has to play a part. And the artists, they held a part. I know in the civil rights movement, what I've learned is like a lot of the artists also help finance the movement and things like that. And so I think this is just a great time for us to really think about what we can do in our own spaces.
Yeah.
Adriel.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Same thing.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. I was just gonna, piggyback on him. I think that what Harrison said is 100% accurate. Working in the creative space, especially in the entertainment field for a long time, artists are the ones who typically are at the forefront of change, and who are at the forefront of revolutions of thoughts and of direction. And so I think that especially now, with this, it's the artists are the ones who have the voice, in a lot of ways create the voice, to give that voice to folks who don't feel heard or who can't be heard. And I think that it's an extreme responsibility of the artist, the creative class, everyone, graphic designers, visual artists, musicians, singers, all the arts that African Americans excel at anyway, that we use those tools. Filmmaking, yourself, Juanita, filmmakers, everyone, really sort of taking control. And just like Harrison said, it's about owning our narrative.
Because they're profiting off of it.
Yeah, exactly. And it's really about owning that narrative. It was, I loved how in the movie they interspersed the film clips, all the way from the 20s, up to today, and just how, non-white folks are portrayed, right? It's, from the shuck and jive, ooh, I'm scared, kind of portrayal of Black men back in the day, to, the step and fetch, scenario, the Uncle Tom's Cabin myth of, slaves being happy, to be there, are all narratives that, were created by other folks. And it's really up to us to sort of take, if we really want the world to look at us differently, then we have to make a concerted effort to portray ourselves differently, and to really get behind what other Black folks are doing as well, or other people of color are doing as well. We need to go out and support those films or those documentaries or those channels or whatever the case may be,
Speaking of which, I feel the need to give a shout out to the filmmakers who were responsible for the documentary series Asian Americans, which aired on PBS just 3-4 weeks ago, a week really before our lives blew up. Because not only was it Asian Americans telling Asian American history, much of which we know as Americans know very little about, but because of the way that they demonstrated how interconnected Black and Brown histories are in this country. And I wanted to really sort of address this broader picture of Black and Brown and global struggles. And interesting thing that James Baldwin said toward the end of the film: the world is not white. White is a metaphor for power, and that's a way of describing Chase Manhattan Bank. Dez, I have to turn to you because I know that you have been working and trying to engage the suburban communities in activism and in the fight against racism and for justice in this country. And I'm wondering how you do that work.
So I do that work by helping to tell the stories. My primary function with the Michigan Roundtable is to oversee the programming related to our traveling exhibit called We Don't Want Them, that talks about the history of race and housing in Metro Detroit. It covers a range of history from like the early 1900s with the Great Migration, and moves into a couple landmark cases following the 1967 rebellion. We have a number of untold stories, or stories that people aren't so familiar with, like Dr. Ossian Sweet, the 8 Mile Wall with Bernice Avery, and the activism work that she did with her community. In that we have Fleta Mathis over on the Old West Side, and that we tell those stories and try to at least begin the conversations then. And I kind of like my work in the respect that it kind of pays me to do what I like to do, and that which is to talk with people and to hear those stories, and then to get to tell those stories back. I've had this exhibit's gotten around the state of Michigan. It was part of the Great Michigan Read with the Arc of Justice. There we go. I'm terrible with names, so forgive me. But with the Arc of Justice, that when it was rotating through the libraries and that, but it's traveled, and it's been a tool even amongst some of our grassroots partners and that in regards to us seeing patterns and that. So we've worked with communities, organizers in Benton Harbor, in Flint, with the Native community in the Upper Peninsula. And what you see are these patterns and that, and within the roundtable and that, we center around a couple of things around critical race theory and looking at housing segregation and that, like that, we look at it as an anchor point in that. And we've done some fantastic, like, I love the space I get to be in that, because I've gotten to like meet John Powell. I've gotten to be with Baba Jaman Jordan, to be able to learn these stories, and that to be able to help share them and that, because there's so much that isn't known. I know for me, and I'll like wrap it up, but I know for me, it was a journey, and that when I joined the roundtable as an intern, it became a story of like self-discovery in that, because I live in Warren. It didn't take me until, and I'm going through college at that time, and it was years before I learned Warren's a sundown town. You know, that was a town that was intentional about making sure that it stayed all white. It it protested a HUD bill, and it turned down funding so that it didn't have to integrate. You know, like, it's amazing, like the amount of stories and information we don't actually have. You know, so for me, it's been like that journey of self-discovery, and then that ability to be able to connect with individuals. So a lot of my work is around connecting with individuals, to share those stories and to keep pushing for us to learn deeper into that history, and then plug those individuals into other organizations and groups that are doing great work and doing boots on the ground. And that.
So you mentioned Arc of Justice, and just wanted to get that out. This is Kevin Boyle's book on the Ocean Suite case.
Yep.
Okay. A lot of people, since I shouldn't say a lot, but some of my white colleagues and friends have had a hard time since George Floyd's death. I've had calls of people apologizing to me, and I'm not sure why they're apologizing. I've had a lot of questions about what can we do. And this question is actually for all of you. What can white people do? What should they be doing?
That's right. You know, I think that I know I've also been getting you know, the text and Facebook messages and things like that from folks who, you know, I really genuinely concerned, but also really feel that they owe it to myself and society to do something, right? So I can't knock it. But you know, what I've told people sometimes is, you know, really all you need to do sometimes is just ask us what we need you to do, right? So that's step one. You know, don't do anything on my behalf, and certainly don't act on my behalf. You know what I'm saying? Like, just ask me. But you know, I think the biggest thing that white America could do to help in these scenarios is to recognize that this is a real thing, number one, but then two, challenge the folks that are in your family or in your friend group, or that you just see out on the street when you see this abhorrent behavior taking place. You know, it's the real question is what do you do? You know, when you're confronted with these experiences, what happens when you're at, you know, the dinner table on Thanksgiving, and you know your Uncle Chad or whatever says some stuff that's really out of line. You know what you can do to help is to challenge that, you know, and to come at them and let them know that that's not acceptable in this place anymore. You know, that's the biggest thing I think they can do.
Harrison.
Yes. Sorry about that.
That's okay. You're good.
Yeah. What was the question?
What can white people do? What should they be doing
Okay.
right now in this moment?
You brought up a good point. They definitely should be listening, and not just acting. But I think what's really important in my work, I work with youth that are experiencing homeless. So language is very important. So I was gonna say homeless youth, but really in working with other youth providers, making sure that that policies are changing, that it's reflected in the way that we provide service to the youth, and removing some of that, and approaching it from a asset frame set, as far as language and your policies and the way that we interact with youth. That framework needs to be changed, because there's some unconscious and some biases there, and some of the supporters that came out to the rally. I was talking about my work. There are youth in the city of Detroit that don't know where they're going to be spending the night, or where they're going to get their next meal from. Their life matters now, not when they not if they ever tragically become a hashtag, but what you can do now is use your time, talent, and treasures to advance the work that we're doing on the ground. And so there was a number of them coming up to find out how they can get involved in the work, as far as volunteering or making a donation, and showing up and really connecting this work. It's the intersectionality. We're all working in different spaces, but it's all connected. And so figuring out just how to push our work and push us in the right direction. That's what white people can do, and leveraging the resources and their privilege. We see a lot of these companies are putting out statements that Black Lives Matter, and they're going to be supporting or Black-led organizations, but are they really putting their money where their mouth is? And that's really, at the end of the day, making sure that the resources are coming into the communities where the work is happening.
Des, can you respond to the question, what can white people do? And then we have some questions that are coming in from our viewers.
Yeah. So I think, like, since there's a James Baldwin quote, I think that just kind of sums this up beautifully, and that around, I cannot believe what you say because I see what you do. And so what in regards to like white people, and that I think one of the biggest things is we have to unlearn and unpack that white supremacy that we have internalized. I mean, I could like just pack it with James Baldwin quotes right now. In regards to like that, we are the embodiment of our history, and we have to unlearn the white supremacy. We have to unlearn that hidden, unspoken language and the stories that are within us, and we have to reconnect to our histories and our identities as a collective. And then we have to be able to talk to other white people about unpacking our relationship to whiteness. We need to understand what it means when we say that whiteness is about power, and how that connects to our identities, and how we perpetuate that in the things that we do every day, in the way that we engage with each other and with others, and people that do or don't look like us. And I think the other big thing is that, most importantly, is that we have to believe the stories that are shared by Black people about their experiences with white supremacy, that we shouldn't be questioning like, oh, did that really happen? Or I think you're taking that too personal, in that like we have to place a value if we're going to begin to reconnect to our humanness and to our humanity. And that, because when we look at that legacy of white supremacy, we look at how it's made us those moral monsters. And in order to undo that, we have to reconnect. And one of the first ways we can do that is by believing the stories coming from our Black community.
And if I could just add, I mean, I think that rewatching this film has sort of made me think that there's a much greater role, and ultimately the burden does fall on white America to do this work. And it's not just giving lip service to Black Lives Matter, but it's actually transforming institutions. You can't just modify something when there's systemic racism, but you have to sort of sometimes tear them apart and rebuild anew. But at the very least, you've got to start calling racism out and refusing to tolerate it in your own space as a starting point. We have a viewer question. I want to follow up on Juanita's framing of Baldwin as a Black gay man, to think critically about this question of visibility as well as unity of Black and Brown histories. I wonder how the panelists see the recognition of intersectionality playing a role in the present movement. Anybody want to take that?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think that intersectionality is extremely important. None of us rise unless all of us rise. And I really do think that, there are multiple, intersections, right, that people live at or people come from. And I think that when you talk about the similarities, again, of what it means to sort of be oppressed in the United States, and that there's always the other, right? So, you can stand on any number of intersections in America and be marginalized, be oppressed, be held back. And, I think that having the viewpoint that these are all, in a way, that they're nuanced in certain ways, but for the most part, these are all the same battle. And that when we interlock our arms and fight this fight together, then we all win. Whether it's the intersection of Blackness and sexuality, of Blackness and femininity, being a woman, sorry, I lost my words for a second, or any other number of, whether that's trans, whatever the intersections that people find themselves at. This is all the battle. This is all a battle against a system that tells you that you are not worth what they are, and that you aren't as valued as they are. And that you should not enjoy the same rights as other human beings do. And when there's one group that's suffering that, then to me, we're all suffering it.
So, I think that becomes also what is extremely important about this revolution, if I may, I'm hoping, that we're experiencing now in every state in this country and across the globe, is that we're seeing people from all walks of life, young and old, Black and Brown and Indigenous and white, gay, straight, transgender, of different classes, of different economic statures coming together. And I just want to say to Harrison, the young shall always lead. So, that was your point earlier, that, it was new to you to see how young these leaders of the 50s and 60s are. And yes, young people are leading this revolution now, and thank goodness.
Yeah, the youth are for the war, and the elders are for the council, and I think that's incredibly important. That I had great experiences as a young person when I was part of Michigan Roundtable Youth internship, where I learned these different tools and tactics and learned about the history, so that now that I've been doing this work for 5+ years, I'm still relatively young, but a lot of the people that are new to this space, I have a sense of responsibility to teach them. And now that I'm in position at my job, I work with young people who have experienced homelessness in their life and using that to now drive action. And so just before the pandemic started, we took a group of young people to Lansing to talk to lawmakers that they have never been in Lansing before, to tell their stories and use it as this place of where it used to be shame, into where now they can, it's a success story. And so things like that. So now that I'm in the space to help other young people activate their voice and their power, it's just amazing that I'm taking a shift in just the way that I organize and think about things, and not letting this moment pass us by. Using the platform that I have, engaging on social media and different things like that.
As we're nearing the end of our time here, I'd like for all of you to address what it's going to take for us to see a huge transformation. People are asking, when are the protests going to end?
You know, it's a really interesting question. It's going to take obviously a huge paradigm shift to occur in America in order for it to happen. And it's interesting enough, it feels, if this movement feels a little bit different right now, because there are so many stakeholders, right, getting into the mix. And it does seem like globally there is a recognition that America is doing something, there's something amiss in America, right? That there's something very, very wrong here. I don't know if protests actually ever do really end. In a sense, I was telling a friend of mine the other day that, simply by waking up every morning, that is a protest in America, for me. My very existence is a protest. But I do think that, again, it's really what I think the way to make this sustainable, or to hope that this one thing that we'd have to do is to America has this really bad attention span, and we have a tendency to just be concerned about something when it's media driven. So I really do hope that it's sustainable and that we don't put everything down when it's no longer a sexy story and being covered on the news every night. And I want a very good quote that came out of the movie for me, which I think sort of sums up something that I think America needs to wrap its head around, is in talking about violence against, the oppressor creating violence against folks, is that violence, that it doesn't reveal to the victim it does not reveal to the victim the strength of the adversary, but on the contrary, it reveals the weakness and the panic of the adversary. And I think that when America realizes that these over-the-top responses that our militarized police force institute on people of color, that's not a sign of strength. It's a sign of weakness. It's a sign of internal fear. And once we recognize that for what it is, we actually have a shot at maybe making a difference.
Dez, final thoughts.
I think Adriel says it so well. And that I hope that in some way the protests don't end in that, because there needs to be that consistent power and pressure on changing the systems. Like right now, we're seeing some potentially revolutionary things. You got Minneapolis City Council now looking at disbanding their police department and starting new. You have you have policies that can come through legislation, and that would force a change on the system. But we need collective, consistent pressure by community across the board in order to be able to maintain and create those changes. We have to be able to see about radically changing these policies now in order for us to be able to continue to do the work in that. And I think it's just like what Adriel said around that pressure needs to be there even after the cameras leave. And that it is probably one of the biggest frustrations, and that is that folks will come out for a moment and then they leave, and it leaves a gap, and it continues to help maintain a status quo, and that which is the oppressive systems that we see.
Harrison.
Yes. I don't want the move. Okay. I don't think the protests are going to end. I think it's gaining momentum. But what needs to happen is the organizers and the organizations that are out there need to be intentional about the action that needs to take place outside of marching and protesting. The education that needs to happen, the organizing, the mobilizing. We have people that want to do something, and so this is a time to move them to action. And I also think that there are different methods to social change. So protesting and marching is bringing the awareness to a lot of the issues and providing us opportunity to have our voices heard. But we need to position ourselves to different structures, to be in positions of power, really, and sit at and be in rooms and be at tables and make our voices heard. So it's going to take a lot of being strategic, really.
Before we take off, I want to thank the hosts of this evening's discussion, and there are a lot of them, and I'm so proud of all of these organizations coming together. Cinema Detroit, the Arab American National Museum, the Detroit Black Film Festival, the Freak Film Festival, Cinema Lamont, Trinity International Film Festival, the Film Lab, and the Senate Theater. Thank you, Harrison Shelby, Dez Squire, Adriel Thornton. I hope to get to meet you all in person at some point in the not too distant future. Aside from virtually, it's really been a pleasure. Thank you so much. I want to leave everyone with one last thought from James Baldwin. He says, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." Thank you for pacing this present moment that we are in. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.